One winter morning, a small-town police station received two alarming phone calls that set off immediate concerns. Officers rushed to the specified address, where they encountered a shocking scene. What followed resembled the plot of a detective thriller, and it would take 7 long years to unravel this chilling story. Only then did the truth become known to the public, though not everyone was prepared for how events would unfold. Connie Dabate was born on July 31, 1976, in the small town of Ellington, Connecticut. She grew up with 2 sisters and a brother. From an early age, she stood out for her kindness and genuine desire to help others, so it was no surprise that she had many friends. These character traits later inspired Connie to pursue a medical education. After graduating from the University of Connecticut, she found work in the sales department of a pharmaceutical company. Additionally, Connie headed up a local charity organization that provided free emergency medical care to those in need. The young woman dreamed of creating a large, loving family. In the early 2000s, her dream began to come true. Connie met a man named Richard, and romantic feelings blossomed between them. The couple married on July 4, 2003, and a few years later, they welcomed their firstborn son. 3 years after that, they were blessed with a second boy. Around the same time, Connie and Richard decided to buy a new home. They settled on a spacious house located in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Ellington, where the family soon moved. The location was perfect for a growing family. The house was plenty roomy, and the boys had space to play in the large backyard. It's worth noting that Richard and Connie's close friends lived nearby, so both families often spent time together. For many years, the family's life could be described as picture-perfect, but everything changed on December 23, 2015. That morning, the police department received 2 urgent calls in quick succession. First, the security company called to report that the alarm had been triggered at Richard and Connie's house. Just 5 minutes later, Richard himself called requesting help. Officers arrived at the scene immediately, where a horrifying sight awaited them. One of the officers entered through the open front door and immediately noticed bloody tracks leading from the basement stairs toward the kitchen. The officer headed to the kitchen, where he found Richard. The man was lying face down, partially tied to an overturned chair with zip ties. There were visible wounds on his body, and another plastic zip tie was around his neck. When the officer called out to Richard, he responded with just one phrase: "He's still in the house." Police immediately called for backup and began thoroughly searching both the building and the surrounding area. But the horrors weren't over. Upon descending to the basement, law enforcement discovered another gruesome find: Connie's body, with a gun lying nearby. Meanwhile, detectives helped Richard free himself. While waiting for the ambulance, he recounted what had happened that morning. Around 8 o'clock, he had driven the boys to the bus stop where they would catch their ride to school, then returned home. There, he changed into his office clothes, got in his car, and headed to work. At the same time, Connie was preparing for a workout session scheduled at the local charity organization's gym. Shortly after Richard left home, he received a notification from the security service about the alarm being triggered. This had happened before, usually caused by their cat when left home alone. Richard also remembered that he'd forgotten his laptop at home, which he needed for work, so he decided to return. Before turning the car around, he messaged his supervisor to say he'd be a bit late, and headed back. According to Richard, he returned to the house sometime between 8:45 and 9 a.m. As soon as he stepped through the threshold, he heard some noise coming from the second floor. Climbing the stairs, he entered the bedroom he shared with Connie and saw a terrifying sight: an unknown man in camouflage with his face covered was rummaging through their closet. Upon noticing Richard, the assailant immediately attacked him and knocked him to the floor. The attacker then demanded his wallet, bank cards, and their PINs, threatening to wait for his family's return and harm them if he didn't comply. But before Richard could react, he heard the garage door opening. It seemed Connie had returned from her workout earlier than usual. He shouted with all his might, warning her of the danger and ordering her to run away. The perpetrator gave chase, but Richard tried to hold him back. During the struggle, the robber managed to push the homeowner down the stairs, and he tumbled to the first floor. While Richard was regaining his senses, Connie ran to the basement where the couple kept 2 guns. The criminal chased after her. Moments later, Richard managed to get up and also headed to the basement. But when he got downstairs, he saw the perpetrator already holding a weapon. The next second, a shot rang out, and the bullet hit Connie. The gunshot was so loud that Richard practically lost his hearing for several minutes. He thought he heard another shot a moment later, but wasn't sure about this. After that, the attacker ordered Richard to sit in a chair and wrapped his arm and leg with plastic zip ties. Then he set aside the gun and, grabbing some wire cutters lying in the basement, inflicted several puncture wounds on Richard with their sharp ends. What happened next was completely incomprehensible. The perpetrator dropped some items on the floor, took out a blowtorch, and set them on fire. Apparently, he was trying to destroy evidence of his presence. Then the attacker returned to Richard and directed the torch's flame at him. However, since the man wasn't completely tied to the chair, he managed to suddenly stand up, knock the torch from the criminal's hands, and, grabbing it, direct the flame right into the attacker's face, setting his mask on fire. Having lost his advantage, the robber fled from the basement as fast as he could. Soon after, Richard was able to get upstairs and call the police. While the man was giving his testimony, law enforcement thoroughly searched the house and surrounding area within a radius of several kilometers but found no trace of the suspect. The only discovery was Richard's wallet lying on the lawn in front of the house. Investigators even called in K-9 units with police dogs, hoping they could track the killer's scent. The dogs were given the wallet to smell since it had supposedly been in the perpetrator's possession. But all attempts proved futile. The dogs repeatedly led detectives back to Richard himself. The handlers tried letting the dogs search through the house, hoping they could detect the scent of an intruder. This attempt also yielded no results. This greatly puzzled the detectives, as trained dogs are typically able to detect traces of human presence even days later. Yet here, none of the 3 dogs could pick up a trail. Another suspicious detail was the time frame during which all these events supposedly took place. Richard claimed that between the moment he entered the house and the robber's escape, no more than 5 minutes had passed. Given that he returned home between 8:40 and 9 o'clock, everything should have been over by 9:05 at the latest. However, the security company only notified police about the alarm being triggered at 10:16 a.m., and Richard himself called just a few minutes later. This meant that over an hour had passed between the attack and the police call. Moreover, Connie had inexplicably returned from her workout much earlier than usual. Richard was taken to the hospital, where doctors examined him and determined that all his injuries were non-life-threatening. There, detectives questioned him again, hoping to get a more detailed description of the attacker. Richard could only say that the perpetrator was tall and burly, and his face was covered by a mask. Meanwhile, medical examiners thoroughly examined Connie's body and determined that she died from 2 gunshot wounds, one to the abdomen and one to the back of the head. The investigation had hit a dead end. There were no leads that could shed light on this horrifying story. Detectives continued questioning Richard, hoping to learn any additional details. But the more questions they asked him, the more suspicious his answers became. During the initial interrogation, Richard claimed that in the morning, he had left for work while Connie was preparing for her workout. However, once at the hospital, he suddenly stated that he couldn't exactly remember which spouse had left the house first. He also couldn't clearly answer whether he had armed the security system before leaving or if his wife had done it. But what troubled detectives most were the discrepancies in his account of the attack. Initially, Richard said that as soon as he entered the house, he heard noise on the second floor. But then his version changed. Now he claimed he hadn't heard any noise and only noticed the perpetrator when he went upstairs to the bedroom. Additionally, Richard first told them that the robber had pushed him down the stairs from the second floor, but then unexpectedly stated that he had tripped and fallen on his own. But the biggest inconsistency concerned the actual moment of the murder. According to Richard, he ran to the basement and saw the attacker wresting the gun away from Connie before shooting her. However, when detectives reminded him of his initial testimony, it turned out he had said something completely different, that he had no idea how the criminal had obtained the weapon. Moreover, by Richard's own words, the basement was pitch dark. So investigators had a logical question: how could he have seen what happened in such conditions? To this, the man responded that he hadn't seen his wife's body since it was too dark, so he wasn't even sure if she had been killed. The detectives' suspicions intensified when they took a closer look at the wounds Richard had allegedly received from the wire cutters. All these cuts turned out to be remarkably superficial and posed no threat to his health or life. But what was most interesting was that most of the injuries were concentrated on the left side of his body. Given that he was right-handed, and his right hand was supposedly free during the incident, he could have easily inflicted these wounds on himself. Furthermore, Richard's body mysteriously lacked any bruises or abrasions, despite his claims of fighting with the attacker and falling down the stairs. Such circumstances should have inevitably resulted in at least some scrapes or bruising, but there wasn't a trace of either. The experts had just as many questions about the blood stains on Richard's shorts. If he had been sitting in the chair while being cut with a sharp object, blood spatters should have inevitably landed on the lower part of his clothing. However, not a single drop was found on his shorts. Equally suspicious was the area in the basement where the robber had allegedly struck Richard with the wire cutters. The floor around the chair should have been heavily covered in blood, but instead, only a few small drops were found. And that wasn't all. According to Richard, after the attacker fled, he lay in the basement for some time recovering his senses, then slowly climbed the stairs to the first floor. But experts didn't find a single drop of blood on any of the steps, although the wounded man should have been dripping blood. Another detail that troubled detectives was an open window in the basement. Investigators suggested that this might have been how the perpetrator entered the house. But here they made a discovery that completely contradicted Richard's version of events. The window latches had been removed from the inside, as had those on other basement windows. Experts even conducted an experiment, trying to open the window from outside. They only succeeded after one of the officers forcefully struck the frame, breaking it along with the glass. So detectives had reasonable doubts that a robber could have opened the window so carefully and quietly without leaving any traces. The collected evidence led investigators to believe that Richard's story might be completely fabricated. To shed light on this puzzling case, detectives decided to visit him again in the hospital and directly ask if the couple had any relationship problems. And here Richard revealed something the investigators hadn't expected to hear at all. He confessed to having a mistress but claimed that Connie knew about it and didn't object. Moreover, he alleged that they and his wife wanted to have a third child, but she couldn't get pregnant. Then, according to him, he suggested using a surrogate mother and even found the perfect candidate, his former classmate Stanya, who had recently divorced and dreamed of having a child. Richard told detectives that he, Stanya, and Connie had supposedly agreed, the classmate would have his child, and then all three would raise it together. Initially, They planned to do the fertilization through medical means, but according to him, the necessary procedure proved too expensive. So the future parents resorted to a more natural and cheaper method. Richard simply entered into an intimate relationship with the woman, resulting in her pregnancy. And, as the man assured detectives, Connie fully approved of this plan and supported the lovers through all stages of its implementation. The version of the story that Richard told raised serious doubts among the detectives, as it sounded extremely implausible and unnaturally contrived. So investigators decided to continue questioning the man, hoping to uncover even more inconsistencies in his testimony. Their efforts weren't wasted. Literally within minutes, Richard's story underwent yet another change. This time, he suddenly stated that his wife Connie and his mistress Stanya had actually never met and hadn't even spoken to each other once. Moreover, Richard admitted that he wasn't even sure if Connie knew about his classmate's pregnancy. During further conversation with the police, the man finally revealed the truth. As it turned out, he had been secretly cheating on his wife with Stanya for several years, and Connie had no idea about it. Of course, the detectives couldn't help but verify this information. When they contacted Richard's mistress, they heard some interesting details. The woman confirmed that their affair with Richard had begun less than a year before the tragic events. According to Stanya, she knew her lover was married, but he assured her that he had already started the divorce process. In June, 6 months before the murder, she became pregnant. Richard insisted that he had already hired a lawyer to handle all the divorce formalities before the baby's birth. But as investigators discovered, the man hadn't actually contacted any legal professionals at all. Interestingly, all of Connie's acquaintances unanimously stated that she had never even hinted at the possibility of divorcing her husband. All these facts forced detectives to look at Richard from a completely different angle. They began to consider him as the main and, essentially, only suspect in his wife's murder. However, police lacked substantial evidence for a full accusation. So they continued to thoroughly work through all possible versions. And here's some interesting details about the couple's life came to light. From friends and relatives of the deceased, investigators learned that Connie had repeatedly complained about an unscrupulous contractor who had done renovation work on their house. Due to poor quality services, the couple had tried to sue the man to recover part of the costs. However, the builder proved to be fearless and openly threatened Connie with physical violence. The woman was so afraid of him that she even convinced Richard to buy 2 guns and install an alarm system in the house. Of course, detectives immediately checked the contractor's involvement in the murder, but he had an ironclad alibi. So investigators had to return to the version that Connie's own husband might have been involved in her death. However, they decided not to disclose this information for the time being, so all the deceased's relatives and acquaintances sincerely believed that she had been killed by some robber. Many openly sympathized with Richard and even tried to support him. But further investigation opened detectives' eyes to some strange facts. In particular, Connie's closest friends were convinced that if she had discovered her husband's infidelity, let alone his mistress's pregnancy, she would have definitely told them about it. Other acquaintances of the couple also unanimously stated that Richard's behavior after his wife's death was, to say the least, odd. The man didn't appear sad or depressed. And a few days after the tragedy, he even sent neighbors a message with a quite mundane question: "Where do you usually order food from?" Gradually, a completely different picture of Connie and Richard's married life began to emerge before the investigators. It turned out they were experiencing serious financial difficulties, and Connie had no idea where the money was disappearing to. Police discovered that Richard was secretly spending their joint funds on supporting his mistress. Interestingly, they found a note titled, "Why I Want a Divorce," on the deceased's phone. In it, she listed all her husband's failures and miscalculations, constant lying, poor treatment of her and the children, unauthorized use of her money, and so on. It seemed Connie herself had been leaning toward the idea of ending the marriage, though she had no concept of the scale of her husband's secret life. Police decided to take a closer look at Richard's financial transactions in the first weeks after his wife's death. Their attention was drawn to two rather suspicious transactions. The first was his unsuccessful attempt to gain access to $500,000 from Connie's insurance account just 5 days after her death. The security service blocked this request. But Richard did manage to get his wife's money, albeit a smaller sum and somewhat later. A month later, he collected a check for $75,000 written to Connie by her employer. All this greatly alarmed the detectives, as it could indicate that Richard had quite concrete financial gain from his wife's death. However, proving his guilt based solely on this data was impossible. The detectives were alarmed by another fact that clearly didn't fit Richard's version about a robber's attack. Less than 3 weeks after his wife's death, 19 days to be exact, the man mysteriously canceled the contract with the security firm. This despite the fact that, by his own words, a killer who still hadn't been caught had invaded their house. Even if Richard was willing to risk his own life, such behavior put the safety of his 2 young sons at risk. So the version about the mysterious criminal became increasingly absurd. Understanding that these considerations alone weren't enough to prove Richard's guilt, detectives decided to petition for another warrant. This time they wanted to examine all electronic devices found in the couple's house. These pieces of evidence would prove decisive in the case. And the police weren't wrong. Putting together all the information from various devices, investigators were able to reconstruct a detailed picture of events that fateful morning. According to security system data, at 8:44 a.m., the garage doors at Connie and Richard's house were opened and closed. Detectives assumed this was when the woman was getting into her car to head to her workout. Their guess was confirmed. By 8:30 a.m., Connie had already appeared on surveillance cameras installed near the gym. At 8:50 a.m., another interesting episode occurred. Richard, who was supposedly still at home, first turned off the alarm system and then activated it again. Most likely, he should have left for work after this. But just 9 minutes later, the security system again recorded the alarm being deactivated, and again remotely, from Richard's key fob. This was strange because if the man had just left, he couldn't have returned home so quickly. His office was at least several kilometers away. Unless he hadn't left at all and was somewhere very close to the house. Although Richard had told detectives he had to return for his laptop, which he'd forgotten at home, his version failed again here. The man claimed he realized he'd forgotten his portable computer when he was already driving to work and received a notification about the alarm being triggered. However, during the time Richard specified, roughly between 8:50 and 8:59 a.m., the security system hadn't recorded any intrusions into the house at all. Therefore, it couldn't have sent any notifications to the owner's phone. However, Richard slipped up. At 9:02 a.m., logging into his email account from his tablet, he did send his boss a letter explaining possible lateness due to the home alarm system being triggered. Here again was an inconsistency. After all, Richard hadn't received any messages from the security firm, as he himself told investigators. It turns out he was writing outright lies to his supervisor. But the most interesting part was something else. According to the tablet's data, at the time of sending the email, Richard was at home and connected to the home Wi-Fi, although he had assured police he was driving several kilometers away from home. So, for the period from 8:59 to 9:02 a.m., the man spent at least 4 minutes in the house. And this despite his claim that between the moment he saw the robber and the latter's escape, no more than 60 seconds had passed. Such a lightning-quick resolution was extremely hard to believe. But the detectives' assumptions were ultimately confirmed by another digital piece of evidence, data from Connie's fitness bracelet. According to it, the woman arrived at the gym at 8:30 a.m., but left after just a few minutes. The class had been cancelled. The bracelet stopped recording Connie's steps at 9:08 a.m., indicating she had gotten into her car and driven home. She must have reached the house around 9:16 to 9:18 a.m. And here's where things got most interesting. Richard claimed the perpetrator attacked Connie immediately after she entered the house. But the fitness tracker data told a completely different story. According to it, between 9:18 and 10:18 a.m., the woman walked 370 meters inside her own house. Moreover, records from her social media accounts showed that from 9:18 to 9:24 a.m., Connie was actively using the internet. It turned out that during this time she was still alive, although according to Richard, she should have been dead since at least 9:05 a.m. So now the police had not just assumptions, but concrete digital evidence that completely disproved Richard's testimony. Collecting this data took more than a year, and finally, in April 2017, investigators were able to arrest the suspect. This news shocked most of the man's acquaintances. None of them had any idea what evidence the police had. Therefore, everyone sincerely considered Richard a victim, not a criminal. Initially, prosecutors insisted on setting bail at $5 million. But Richard's attorney managed to prove that his client had no prior criminal record and had 2 minor children in his care. Eventually, the court reduced the bail amount to $1 million. Richard immediately posted the required funds and was released pending trial. However, the hearings in the case were constantly postponed, so the trial didn't begin until 5 years later, in April 2022. During this time, Richard's defenders managed to collect a number of pieces of evidence that cast doubt on his guilt. In particular, the attorneys stated that 6 DNA samples belonging to an unknown person were found in the house. Additionally, experts found too few traces of gunpowder on Richard's hands. If he had shot Connie, there should have been much more. However, prosecutors easily refuted these arguments. They noted that gunpowder residue samples were only taken several hours after Richard was brought to the hospital. During this time, he could have simply washed or wiped away most of the traces. The discovered DNA samples were equally weak evidence. After all, nothing indicated that they belonged specifically to the mysterious perpetrator rather than to acquaintances or guests of the couple who had visited their home at least once. For their part, the prosecution presented the jury with numerous digital pieces of evidence that completely demolished Richard's version and proved that Connie died at least an hour after she was supposedly shot by the robber. Up until 10:18 a.m., she was freely moving around the house and active on social media, which was clearly impossible for a dead person. Richard's own testimony became additional ammunition for prosecutors, as it contained many inconsistencies and constantly changed. So the prosecution used each of these contradictions as yet another proof that the defendant was lying. The trial lasted 22 days, and on May 10, 2022, Richard was found guilty. He received 65 years in prison, but despite this, he continued to maintain his innocence. This verdict was a heavy blow for Connie's relatives, as they had believed the story about the robber until the very end and only learned about all the evidence of Richard's guilt during the trial. After these facts were made public, only a very naive listener could doubt the justice of the verdict. Despite the obviousness of the evidence, the convicted man's attorneys stated their intention to appeal the verdict. At the time of this article's publication, all their attempts to reopen the case have been unsuccessful. As for Connie's children, after their father's arrest, the court granted custody to the deceased's relatives. At the time of their mother's murder, they were 6 and 9 years old. Despite their young age, the boys had to live under the same roof with her killer until the very end. That's all for now. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future content. Take care and goodbye.